Jesus, flipping over tables, is one of those stories that sticks in the mind because it seems somewhat out of character with Jesus's usual way of being. Honestly, it has an edge of violence in it that's a bit alarming, and paired with the seeming arbitrary cursing of the fig tree, it makes for a weird narrative. And certainly, if we isolate the stories, fig tree from temple cleansing, it really makes no sense. But you have to realize in Mark that there are these things that scholars elegantly call Markan sandwiches. And no, not pastrami, not turkey. Rather, a story that sits in the middle of a bigger story. So here, the temple cleansing sits in the middle of a story about fig trees. Tree is cursed, go to the temple, tree is found again. Markan sandwiches tell us that the stories are meant to be packaged together, that they interpret one another. So fig tree and temple are packaged together. They comment on each other. Additionally, unlike so many stories in the New Testament, the temple cleansing actually occurs in all four Gospels, but each emphasizes something different. In John, the emphasis clearly is on the temple being turned into a market. In Matthew, it's about prayer and healing. In Luke, it's about Jesus bringing a new teaching. And both all three, Mark, Luke, and Matthew, quote this passage from Isaiah about being a house of prayer. But only Mark includes that it's a house of prayer for all nations, because Mark is emphasizing something different about the temple cleansing, that there are people being excluded. So, if we want to flip over to the Isaiah passage being quoted, should that be your jam right now? It's chapter 56. We find the prophet proclaiming how God is extending the covenant with Israel to everyone, but particularly to foreigners and eunuchs. In this case, both groups were extreme outsiders, considered beyond the covenant. But God says in this passage from Isaiah that they follow the law, and so they have a place in God's covenant, a place in God's salvation. Isaiah writes that God, quote, gathers the outcasts of Israel. Then the chapter continues with the castigation of Israel's rulers, calling them such wonderful things as blind sentinels and wild dogs. It's the unexpected eunuchs and foreigners that are included in God's salvation. No thanks to the people who are excluding them. And so something about that passage triggers Jesus' memory of it when he walks into the temple. In Mark, Jesus particularly attacks the dove sellers, the sacrifice that only the poor could afford. Something exploitative is happening there. He also accuses the place of being a den of robbers, a phrase elsewhere translated, particularly in Josephus, as a cave of bandits. So he's not just accusing them of being robbers, but of creating this little insular place where they feel safe enough to just enjoy their spoils. And then, unlike every other gospel where this occurs, Jesus halts all proceedings. Mark says that he stops letting anyone carry anything into the temple, liturgical or otherwise. He halts everything. For Jesus, this exclusion, this exploitation, this taking advantage of people is so wrong that liturgy cannot proceed. Justice goes with liturgy. Jesus isn't new in this. If you were to pick I don't know, any Hebrew Bible prophet and look through there, you would find that the prophets always link justice with right worship. They flow together. They're inseparable. And that's what Jesus does in this story. He says, you want to sell things and exploit people? You want to exclude certain people? Fine, but worship can't continue. And so he flips over the tables and halts all proceedings. It's no wonder then that the temple authorities decide that it might be time for him to meet a rather grisly end. Jesus goes to the temple to be in his Father's house, but instead he finds a travesty. He goes there for the fruit of prayer and peace, and instead finds exclusion and exploitation, fruitlessness. And now perhaps the fig tree makes more sense. The judgment on one interprets the judgment on the other. The fruitless fig tree is exactly like the fruitless temple, neither bearing into the world what is theirs to offer. And Jesus follows up his treatment of the fig tree in the temple with a teaching on prayer and the power of connection to the Spirit, which is the key to fruitfulness. Jesus expects the fruit tree to have figs. He expects the temple to be a place of holiness, but instead, both are barren. Both are judged, both found wanting. Both have lost connection to their life force and purpose. Maybe not intentionally, maybe gradually and over time, maybe an unconscious erosion, but they've lost connection to what would bring fruit. There are quite a few things one could contemplate from this text, but two seem outstanding to me. This Jesus who flips over tables to undo wrong is exhilarating. We see him marching into places of injustice and cruelty and evil, places we see as so obviously catering to the few over the many. Dare we even say into churches where we think worship should stop because exclusion is done. It gives us a kind of high to imagine it. It's possible to even get that kind of oxytocin jump from just seeing another deed done, evil cleared up. Except that this forgets something. Jesus flips over tables in a place people love, a place they hold dear, a place that imagines itself to be fruitful. And so if you want the real truth of the text, it's watching Jesus walk into our sacred spaces, places we love, and flip over things that we think are just fine. Just as with the temple, exclusion, injustice, they slip in over time. That kind of unconscious erosion of God's norms. And worship doesn't make sense when it sits beside inequality or exploitation or exclusion, conscious or unconscious. It's hard to critically examine things dear to us. And the pain of this text is examining where that kind of exclusion and exploitation are occurring in the institutions we love. And maybe it wasn't intentional, and maybe it happened over time. But Jesus, he flips over the table to make us aware, to wake us up. But take one step deeper. Within each of us, worship and injustice live side by side in ways we'd rather not acknowledge. So it isn't just Jesus sweeping into institutions, it's Jesus sweeping into our very selves and clearing some space, halting the proceedings, in order to get us to come to new realizations, to recognize what is gradually unconsciously developed. I can do no better to describe this than a poem by Mark Burroughs and John Sweeney derived from, you guessed it, a Meister Eckhart sermon. There is no need to wonder why Jesus threw everyone out of the temple that day. He wanted it empty. The temple is inside you, and the Lord wants it all to himself. Rather than an invitation to imagine Jesus flipping tables in places we've decided are unjust, we have to imagine Jesus flipping tables in places we love and in our own hearts. But there's great promise in that, really. Only in cleansing can something new come. Only when the unfruitfulness withers can something fruitful grow. The text ends with prayer, with the endless possibility of connection to the Spirit. And it mentions forgiveness of others, but of self, and allowing God to forgive us. After all, we aren't cursed fig trees, we're inconsistent humans. Jesus bothers with driving out what buys and sells in our soul and institutions so that we can bear forth our unique gifts to the world. It's a cycle, one that is our life's work, to be open to the cleansing, and through our prayerful connection to God, bear ever more fruit.